What if I told you the greatest football player who ever lived died alone in a rented house surrounded by people who were supposed to be protecting him? Not on a football pitch, not in front of 100,000 fans chanting his name, but in a bed, in a quiet room, with almost nobody watching. Diego Maradona gave the world some of the most magical moments football has ever seen. But behind the fame, behind the trophies, there was a final chapter of his life that most people never really understood. A chapter full of warning signs that were ignored, promises that were broken, and people who should have saved him, but didn't. Today, I'm going to walk you through the real story of Diego Maradona's final days. Not the highlight reel, not the hand of God clip you've seen 1,000 times, the truth. Pause. And by the end of this video, you might see Maradona's story in a completely different light. Let's get into it. The boy from Villa Fiorito. To understand how Maradona's story ended, you first have to understand how it began. Because everything that happened in his final years is connected to where he came from. Diego was born in 1960 in a place called Villa Fiorito on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. This wasn't just a poor neighborhood. This was a shanty town, dirt roads, no running water in some homes, kids running around barefoot because their families simply couldn't afford shoes. Diego was one of 8 children. His father worked in a factory. His mother did everything she could to keep the family fed. And in the middle of all that hardship, there was a ball, a football. It became Diego's escape, his joy, the one thing in his life he could completely control. By the time he was a teenager, people in Argentina already knew his name. He was doing things with a football that grown men twice his size couldn't do, juggling it in interviews, nutmegging defenders like it was nothing. There's old footage of a tiny Diego doing tricks before a match, and even then, you can just tell, this kid was different. But here's the thing nobody talks about enough. Poverty doesn't just disappear once you become famous, it leaves a mark. Diego carried the weight of an entire family, later an entire country, on his shoulders from the time he was basically a child. And that kind of pressure, it shapes a person in ways that don't always show up until much later in life. Keep that in mind, because it matters for everything that comes next. The rise that changed football forever. Diego's talent exploded onto the world stage in the 1980s. He moved to Barcelona, then to Napoli, a club that, before Maradona arrived, had basically never won anything of note. And then 1986 happened, the World Cup in Mexico. This is the tournament people usually remember him for. The hand of God goal against England, where he punched the ball into the net and somehow convinced the referee it was a header. And then, just minutes later, arguably the greatest solo goal in football history, where he ran through half the England team like they weren't even there. Argentina won that World Cup almost single-handedly because of him. He wasn't just a player anymore. He became a symbol, a working-class kid who beat the world. But here's the part that gets left out of most highlight videos. Around this exact same time, during the biggest moments of his career, Maradona was already being introduced to something that would quietly destroy him over the next 3 decades: cocaine. It started in Barcelona. It grew heavier in Napoli, where he had connections to people in organized crime, the Camorra, the Italian mafia, who supplied him with the drug and, some say, protected him from consequences for years. While the world was watching him lift trophies, a much darker story was unfolding behind closed doors. And that's the pattern you're going to see again and again in Maradona's life. Incredible highs on the pitch, paired with a private battle that almost nobody could see. The addiction, the world ignored by the early 1990s, the cracks were showing. In 1991, Maradona failed a drug test in Italy and was banned from football for 15 months. It was one of the first times the public really had to confront what was happening behind the scenes. Think about that for a second. The most famous athlete on the planet, a man treated like a god in Argentina and Naples, was fighting a cocaine addiction in plain sight, and instead of getting real, sustained help, he kept playing, he kept performing, because that's what the world wanted from him. There's a pattern with people who become famous too young, carrying too much responsibility too early. They often don't get permission to be human, to struggle, to ask for help without the whole world watching and judging. Maradona lived his entire adult life under that kind of pressure. Every failure was a headline. Every relapse was a scandal. He tried to come back. He played in the 1994 World Cup for Argentina, and for a moment, it looked like the old magic was still there. He scored a stunning goal against Greece and celebrated by screaming into a pitchside camera, eyes wide, veins popping, a celebration that, looking back now, honestly looks less like joy and more like something else entirely. Days later, he failed another drug test, this time for ephedrine. He was sent home from the World Cup in disgrace, and it was effectively the end of his career as an elite player. But it wasn't the end of his story. Not even close. In some ways, it was just the beginning of the hardest chapter. The years the cameras didn't show. After his playing career ended, Maradona's life became a cycle. Weight gain, health scares, attempts at rehab, public appearances where he looked completely unlike the electric athlete the world remembered. In 2000 and again in 2004, he had heart attacks linked to cocaine use. In 2004, he was hospitalized in a serious condition, and doctors in Argentina said his heart was functioning at a fraction of what it should be for a man his age. He was rushed to intensive care. Reports at the time said his life genuinely hung in the balance. He survived. He always seemed to survive, and that's part of what makes his eventual death so hard for people to process, because Maradona had cheated death so many times before, people almost stopped believing it could actually happen. He had a gastric bypass surgery in Colombia to control his weight, which worked for a while. He became a football manager, even coaching the Argentine national team at a World Cup. He kept showing up, kept fighting his way back into the public eye. Because football, being seen, being loved by crowds, was the closest thing Diego had to peace. But privately, those closest to him say the addiction never fully left. It just changed shape. Alcohol, prescription medication, painkillers for his knees, his hips, his back. A body that had been pushed to its absolute limits since childhood. By the late 2010s, Maradona was in his late 50s, but his body looked decades older. And that's the man who walked into the final year of his life. 2020. The year everything came apart. Now we get to the part of the story that really matters. The final days. In 2020, Maradona was working as head coach of Gimnasia de la Plata, a football club in Argentina. Even at 59 years old, even in visibly poor health, he was still on the touchline, still shouting instructions, still living inside the game that made him, and, in many ways, unmade him too. But people around him were worried. Video from that year shows a man who looked frail, unsteady on his feet, sometimes needing help just to walk. On November 3rd, 2020, just weeks before he died, Maradona celebrated his 60th birthday. Friends and former teammates visited. He looked tired, thin, not himself. 3 days later, on November 7th, Maradona underwent emergency surgery to remove a blood clot from his brain, a subdural hematoma. It's a serious procedure, and here's where the story starts to turn dark. After the surgery, doctors recommended that Maradona recover in a proper clinical facility, or at the very least, in a home with round-the-clock, highly qualified medical supervision. Instead, he was discharged and sent to a rented house in Tigre, a suburb outside Buenos Aires. And what happened in that house over the next 18 days is something that Argentina and the football world is still trying to fully come to terms with. The house in Tigre. Picture this, Imais, one of the most beloved athletes to ever live, a man millions of people around the world genuinely worshipped, recovering from brain surgery in a rented house with a care team that, according to later investigations, was not equipped to handle a patient in his condition. Reports that came out afterward described a chaotic situation, inconsistent medical monitoring, a lack of proper psychiatric and addiction specialists, despite Maradona's long, well-documented history of substance abuse. Family members and people close to him later said they were alarmed by what they were seeing, but felt shut out or ignored. There were warning signs. Maradona reportedly wasn't sleeping properly. He wasn't eating enough. There are accounts of him appearing disoriented in videos from that period. People who saw him in his final week described him as looking noticeably worse than just days before. And yet, life around him carried on as if everything was fine. This is one of the parts of Maradona's story that honestly makes you angry once you understand it, because it wasn't a mystery that Diego Maradona needed serious, specialized medical and psychological care. His history made that obvious. But in his final weeks, multiple people later testified that level of care simply wasn't there. November 25th, 2020. On the morning of November 25th, 2020, staff at the house in Tigre went to check on Maradona. He wasn't breathing. Paramedics arrived and tried to resuscitate him for over half an hour. It didn't work. Diego Armando Maradona, the boy from Villa Fiorito who became a god to millions, was pronounced dead. The official cause was acute pulmonary edema, secondary to chronic heart failure. Within minutes, the news hit every corner of the planet. In Argentina, the government declared 3 days of national mourning. Tens of thousands of people lined the streets of Buenos Aires just to be near his casket at the Casa Rosada, the presidential palace, where his body lay for public viewing. Grown men wept in the streets. Fans who never met him fell to their knees. Napoli, the Italian city he'd given a first-ever league title to decades earlier, lit candles and painted murals overnight. It was one of the largest outpourings of public grief for an athlete in modern history. But behind all that grief, behind the tears and the chants of his name, a very different story was quietly unfolding. Because almost immediately, people started asking a very uncomfortable question. Could this have been prevented? The investigation. In the weeks after Maradona's death, Argentine authorities launched a criminal investigation, not into a stranger, not into some vague circumstance, into the very people who had been paid and trusted to take care of him in his final days. A medical board was assembled to review the case. Their conclusions were damning. The report stated that Maradona had shown clear signs of deterioration in the days leading up to his death, and that his medical team failed to act on those warning signs. It described his final period of care as, in essence, inadequate and negligent. 7 members of his medical team, including his personal physician, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and nurses, were formally investigated for potential involuntary manslaughter. The allegation wasn't that anyone intentionally hurt him. It was something, arguably just as troubling, that a legend was left to decline, largely unmonitored by people who should have known better. Text messages between members of the medical staff were later leaked to the press, and they painted an unsettling picture. Conversations that, according to reports, showed more concern about scheduling and logistics than the urgent medical reality of the man in their care. Let that sink in for a second. One of the most famous human beings on Earth. A man whose face is tattooed on fans' bodies across multiple continents. And in his final days, some of the people closest to him were, according to investigators, failing him in the most basic ways. The trial into his death has stretched on for years since, with hearings, delays, and testimony from dozens of witnesses, nurses, doctors, even his own daughters, who publicly said they believed their father had been let down. The man behind the myth. Here's what I think gets lost when we talk about Maradona. We remember the hand of God. We remember the impossible dribble against England. We remember the trophies, the chants, the murals. But Maradona wasn't a myth. He was a person who grew up with almost nothing, who was thrown into unimaginable fame as a teenager, who battled addiction for over half his life, and who, even in his final weeks, frail, unwell, clearly struggling, was still surrounded by cameras and crowds instead of the quiet, specialized care he actually needed. There's a tragic irony in it. The very love the world had for Maradona, the constant demand for him to keep showing up, keep coaching, keep being Diego, may have made it even harder for the people around him to admit just how sick he really was. Addiction, especially the kind that begins in your 20s and follows you for 30 years, doesn't just go away because you get older or because the world stops watching as closely. It changes shape. it hides, and if the people around you aren't equipped or willing to see it clearly, it can be fatal. That's ultimately what a lot of the evidence from his final days points to. Not one single dramatic moment, but a slow, largely preventable decline that far too many people either missed or chose not to see. What his death revealed. In the years since Maradona died, his story has become something bigger than football. It's become a conversation about how society treats its most famous, most beloved people. We turn them into gods. We put them on murals, on jerseys, on flags. But we often forget they're still human beings with human struggles. Struggles that don't disappear just because someone can do magic with a football. Argentina still grieves him deeply, Napoli still worships him, but alongside that grief, there's now a growing, uncomfortable understanding that the very system meant to protect Maradona in his final chapter failed him. Not because nobody cared, but because caring from a distance, through applause and adoration, isn't the same as being there in the room when someone actually needs help. Diego Maradona gave the world some of the most joyful moments football has ever produced. But his final days remind us of something much heavier. That even the people we put on the highest pedestals can be the loneliest people in the room. So when you think about Diego Maradona now, I hope you think about more than just the hand of God or that run through the England defence in '86. I hope you think about a kid from Villa Fiorito who never really got to put the ball down, who carried the weight of a whole country from the time he was a teenager, who fought battles most of us will never fully understand, and who, in the end, needed the people around him to actually see him, not just cheer for him. That, to me, is the real story of Diego Maradona's final days. Not a scandal, not a headline, a warning about fame, about loneliness, about how easy it is to love someone from a distance, and how hard it can be to actually save them up close. If this story moved you the way it moved me putting it together, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more real, honest stories about the players behind the legends. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.